Hey parents, have you ever asked your children, how was school today? Did they ever answer, school is dumb? Well then, this podcast is for you. Listen in as we unpack why children say school is dumb and discover what it really means. I'm your host, Shannon Hazel, also known as the Parents Educator. After 25 years of teaching and being a parent myself, I've heard every reason as to why school is dumb. So let's dive in and uncover what it really means. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm your host, Shannon Hazel, also known as the Parents Educator. Today's topic is a really important one, and I'm excited to get into this conversation. Oral communication impacts essentially every facet of our lives. It's a huge factor in academic success at school, but it's also a huge factor in children's happiness at school, their enjoyment of school, and it really takes adults to be dialed into their children's milestones as babies, as toddlers, to identify as soon as possible if something is amiss, because as the research tells us, early intervention is key. So I'm super excited to welcome to the podcast today Stacey Alexander, who is a speech language pathologist. Stacey works daily in the elementary school setting, in addition to having her own private practice. She's been a speech language pathologist for over 15 years and brings with her such a wealth of knowledge. So I'm excited to get started. Welcome, Stacey.
Hi, thank you. That was a really nice introduction.
You like what I said about you?
Yeah, but even just summarize, like it really hit home the importance of oral language there. I really liked that.
Oh.
So you kind of did the first part of my job.
Oh, well, perfect. We'll just come along for the ride then. I got this.
You do. You know what you're talking about.
This is such a huge topic, but we're going to attempt to kind of break it down and simplify it today the best we can, but it really is such a huge topic. And when you hear oral language, it's kind of like one of those vague terms that you're like, okay, so someone's talking, but it's really so much more than that, right? So,
and I'll be honest, even when I took a school board position, oral language was used a lot, and I thought, what are they talking about, right? And I had to do my own, like in university, we were taught these things, but I really had to delve into the specifics of what oral language is. And I think in general, I have a really good understanding of it now, and teachers do, but parents probably would be similar to how I was, right? Like hearing I hear what oral language is, but what is it, right?
There's so many components underneath it that you would never even think of.
Right.
And that's where we're really going to get to today is those components and what happens when there's a breakdown or a deficit in even one of those components, right? And what can that look like for kids? So maybe we can start with the big umbrella term oral language, and you can kind of break that down for us and tell us what that means.
So I think we've already established oral language is complex, right? It is a complex system that is comprised of sounds and words to get communication across, right? And it evolves along a developmental continuum. So it starts from our little babies when they're, even just looking at you, they're communicating, right? But they're not really saying anything yet. So it moves from that to them making sounds or crying, and then it moves to, babbling and then putting together words and then little phrases and sentences. So it does move along a nice continuum for us. However, again, there can be breakdowns where it's not really going the way we hope it is. And it's also comprised of, I would say, 5 elements. So I like to think of oral language in the center. The visual that I like to think of is it's in the middle of a circle, and then there's like these extenders off of the big term oral language. So one of them would be vocabulary, which is word knowledge and meaning of words. So the words that children are learning and that they're using. Another one would be syntax, so that would be combining words into phrases and sentences, so like their sentence structure. Another one would be morphology, so again that is like specific details of words, so might be word endings. So for example, like past tense, we would add on for regular past tense we would do like the t, so jumped, right? So we would add that on. Plurals, we would add in like the s sound. So cats, and that s represents two cats, not or more cats, maybe more than one. But if we leave that s off, then we know we're just talking about one cat, right? So those little things. Pragmatics, so that's knowing how and when to use language. So, if you're engaging in conversation with someone, you can gauge when it's your turn to talk, the rules of conversation, storytelling, things like that. And then phonology, so that's the sound system. That language is made up of sound systems, right? So there are sounds in words, there are syllables in words, words rhyme, that sort of thing. So all of those 5 things are oral language, altogether oral language, right?
When we put them together, right?
Yes.
And when you think of that, you can almost when, their children are babies, toddlers, you can kind of see those a little more isolated. And as we get older, it all kind of comes together, right?
Yes.
But you can think of, children saying things like "go park now," right? That's their attempt to start to put those words together with syntax and make a sentence, sort of thing. So it really is complex, and the fact that most people just kind of pick it up and go on their merry way and learn to be great communicators and have strong oral language is almost amazing, because there's so much going on there and so much that needs to be learned, right?
Yes. And that they learn it just through exposure. A lot of these things aren't explicitly taught. Like, we aren't engaging with our little 3-year-old saying, oh, well, look, there's 2 cats there. We have to add this cats, right? We just say, oh, there's 2 cats. And then somehow these kids just subconsciously learn it.
Pick up these rules,
They pick up these language rules that they're just exposed to. But again, there's so many kids that I see that I get referrals to that just they're not picking it up, right? And whether it's grammar, syntax, vocabulary, right? It's that sort of thing. So I do think we're very lucky that the people who are able to just pick it up naturally, right? And then there's these other children sometimes that just there's that breakdown, and so part of my job is to kind of help figure out where the breakdown is happening and all of that. And in the language, it affects, like you were saying in the introduction, is so many parts of our lives, right? And one of my favorite quotes, and I can't even remember who said it, but I think it's on one of my shirts. And it says, reading and writing float on a sea of talk. So the talk is the oral language, right? And if we don't have that oral language, reading will be affected, writing will be affected. And that's just one part of our life that would be affected if we didn't have strong oral language. You mentioned happiness in the introduction. So our social interactions, right? If we have difficulty understanding things that are going on in our daily life and communicating things to people we care about or whatnot, you might be kind of miserable, right? Because it will be a struggle. Things will be hard for you to do throughout your daily life. So, I always have compassion for our kids who are struggling with language development, because I just know deep down, like, life in general, the day-to-day life is hard for them sometimes, So, and it depends, right? Sometimes I just get a referral for children who it's like, oh, their grammar, the grammar might be off, right? And sometimes that's kind of easy to fix. We do activities where we focus really on that, again, plurals or past tense. And usually, they can pick it up, right? But it's like those little bit more complex language skills like vocabulary and the pragmatics sometimes that are harder to kind of get sometimes. But
so before we get into some of those strategies, I'm just wondering your opinion on, so we hear a lot about we need to read to our kids, right? From a young age, reading is so important. So where does reading fit into oral language development?
It is probably the best thing you can do to model rich oral language for a child. So it doesn't matter where you live, your socioeconomic status. You can get your hands on some books, and you're providing children with that nice sentence structure, right? Because when we read books, it's always written in proper sentence structure. So whether or not maybe they're exposed to adults in their life that may not, sometimes maybe they use incorrect grammar or whatnot, right? That book will always have that proper sentence form and grammatical forms. It also has, usually some nice, rich vocabulary in there. So vocabulary that they might potentially never really be exposed to in their daily life. So let's say a little one read a book about a farm, right? And they lived in the city. So you're providing them with that vocabulary about a farm, but they may never be able to get to a farm for a few years from now or whatever, right? So it's like you're giving them that whole world of exposure to vocabulary and things that they can't physically be exposed to. We can't expose our children to every single thing ever, right? So again, books are like the gateway, and even Oprah, like she's even so passionate about reading because she knows like you can give these kids who are coming from low income areas, if you teach them to read, then you're giving them the world, right? So it's just such a big part, right? And I think, going back to babies, that's when you build your first connection with them, as they sit on their lap and you're turning pages with them and you're commenting on similar things together, and it also creates that relationship with the child, right? Being able to just do something.
Starts to develop that back and forth conversation between parent and child, right? Which can springboard into other things as they get older, different conversations.
And I wish I had the numbers in front of me, but probably in this book over here, but it'll take me a while to find it. But, again, children who are read to every single day, their vocabulary exposure, the number of words that they're exposed to compared to kids who aren't read to every day are significant. That gap, from the kids that are read to periodically versus the ones that are read to every single day, they're getting those vocabulary words exposed to them much more than the kids that aren't. So books are probably one of the most important little easy things you can do every day, right, to really help close the gap or expose your child to as much language as possible.
Right. Okay, from there, let's shift to some of those indicators. So what are some things parents might notice, whether it's from a very young age or even as their kids get into school, that may be indicators that their child has a deficit in one of these oral language areas?
Yeah, I think it would, depends on what age you're looking at. Obviously if they're really little, there are, those milestones that parents might kind of refer to, right? So, okay, when they're 18 months, they should have this many words, right? And so they can kind of gauge looking at milestones. I know sometimes parents just Google them and they call me, from privately and say, okay, my little one's not doing this. So again, it depends on what age, but some of the general things you might notice, it could be some frustration possibly, right? If you have a child who's having a hard time expressing themselves, whether it's a 2-year-old or someone in grade 6 or something, right?
Right.
They might have a hard time organizing their thoughts, so and sharing how they might be feeling if it's an issue that they're having. Or you might read a book with them, and maybe they're having a hard time answering questions about it or retelling it back to you, or you might find that they don't really understand what's kind of happening in the story, or they get the big picture of it. It could also be, again, I think it depends on what oral language skill you're looking at, right? So you might notice their grammar and sentence structure doesn't seem to be coming along and developing. The pragmatics, again, it could be social interaction. So are they having a hard time reading like subtleties with someone that they're engaging with, and then so they don't pick up on cues from another child, and then so then there's again that trouble forming friendships and whatnot. So it could be lots of different things. Again, I think it sort of just depends on where the breakdown is happening in their oral language development.
And would you say it maybe needs to be prevalent like over some time? So if they're in one stage and you're noticing grammar, you're noticing they're having some challenges expressing themselves, or they're getting frustrated, or playing with another child, if it's just that occasion or a couple of times,
right,
we can maybe try some strategies to move them forward. But if it tends to go on over more time.
Yeah, I
that
know what
we
you're
tend
saying.
to be a little more
Yeah,
concerned.
like I think, as parents, we always say early intervention, don't wait, right? But at the same time, like sometimes parents, we do kind of wait a bit, right? Like we're kind of like, like I know by now they should be doing this, but maybe if I give it another couple of months. And then this is what also happens is sometimes I get a phone call, again for private support, and and I go to meet the child, and then I get there, they might be on a wait list for like a month or two, and then all of a sudden the parents are like, you know what? Now they're talking.
Right, and I feel like that's
so,
the caveat with the milestones, right?
Yes.
Because it really is a continuum.
Yes.
Kids develop all at their own
Right.
pace.
Yeah.
And I think if, you're following your parenting books or something online you found, and it's like they're exactly, 2.5 years old, and it says at 2.5 they should do this.
Yes.
It could be
It's
2.75.
Yes.
It could be 3. Like, I think we have to know what the milestones are, and would you say if they are happening in order, but maybe not necessarily the exact timeline, we're probably okay?
I think so, yeah. And some parents will say, like, they're always just like the slight, like they do move along, but it's just like on their own time or at their own pace. And so I hear that a lot too. And then this is the other thing that I notice a lot is these little JK students, they come into school, and sometimes school is the very first place they've ever interacted with other kids and been in that setting, right? And depends on their daycare exposure before they come to school. And, then these are where these conversations with teachers come up is, okay, I'm noticing some things about a few of these children. And then so sometimes we go through the consent process, and then I meet with the child, and I'm like, okay, I get some ideas on what to work on. So we work on oral language or even articulation, their speech sounds. And then SK comes around, and then, or it could be even up to grade 1, but then they do catch up. Like it's kids generally do pick up these skills, right? But again, I think it's like what you're saying. It's kind of more on their own time, but then also they are getting the intervention, right? So
Which isn't going to hurt.
No, and
Right.
who knows? Like sometimes I always say, like sometimes I don't know if it was the intervention or just development, right? Sometimes I can tell for sure, like it is because we worked on this, that this little guy is getting these skills. But I think, or they go hand in hand, right? Developmentally they're improving, and then they also got that intervention. But I would say, like, as from a parent, trust your gut and try not to ignore those little, should my little guy be, it doesn't hurt to just explore that more.
To reach out, ask some questions. And I think too, talking to other parents, right? Because inevitably you're going to have another parent who's probably been through what you've been through, either with that child that's the same age or an older child, and they can kind of offer you some reassurance that, they did sort themselves out, right?
Yeah.
So,
and I think maybe this is more about like speech, right? Like I think speech kind of kids do, they do move along. But for language, like we want to be careful with that, because sometimes I think if, waiting too long on that language intervention, then that gap can get bigger, right? Like,
and I think that's a good thing to differentiate. A lot of times, parents might think of speech language services as articulation, but it's so much more than that articulation piece, right?
And sometimes speech, like if a child has a lot of speech sound errors, the language will be affected. So they will have a hard time forming those words, so then they may not choose to say much, right? So then that affects oral language. So I think it just sort of, I think oral language is something that is, like working on oral language is something that's never going to be harmful for a child, right? Having someone take a look and see, does my child need some support with oral language and even articulation, right? It's not going to hurt to have somebody check it out.
And go from there, for sure. So what are some strategies then? I guess maybe we'll start with the very obvious one, the articulation piece, before we kind of get into the other areas of oral language. What are some things parents can do if they're thinking, my child's not making this letter sound correct or this letter sound? What would you recommend in that scenario for a parent at home?
Well, again, so similar to oral language, articulation develops along a continuum in terms of what sounds develop at certain ages. So, you might have a concern about a little guy who's not saying their TH sound, but they might be in, 4. So that would be very developmentally appropriate. So I think it depends on what the articulation error is, but that's where, again, a speech pathologist could do an assessment for you or a screen to determine if your concerns are something to work, to help your child with.
Okay. Is there any other area that you kind of want to hone in on and you have maybe some recommendations for parents in terms of oral language deficits, what they might be seeing, and some strategies they could try before they maybe make that reaching out phone call?
Well, I think, naturally, when, if we're working with or if we're interacting with the child that doesn't understand maybe what we're trying to say to them or doesn't understand something that we're trying to teach, I think what we naturally, I think we repeat it, right? We'll say, okay, I'm going to repeat what we just read or repeat that question. Sometimes another strategy is rewording the question. So sometimes when we ask questions or give directions, sometimes we almost do it backwards. So a backwards example would be like, okay, before you go put on your shoes, go get your coat. Right. So that child's getting the last thing you want them to do first. In that direction, right? So sometimes we have to think about the way we're speaking to our child. That might be affecting their comprehension. So that would be one thing. Another suggestion I could give would be just providing that model, right? So if you have a child who is demonstrating grammatical errors, let's say. So, and I do this with my little guy. So, today, what did he say today? Something about, he flied into the sky. I'm like, well, and now he knows what I'm doing, but I'll say, did he fly into the sky or he flew into the sky? And then he's like, he flew into the sky. So I give him the correct, or the choice, I give him choices and then he picks the correct one. But I could also simply just respond back and say, he flew into the sky? He flew into the sky. Oh, okay. What did he do? And then I kind of check to see if he'll repeat back. He flew into the sky. And if he doesn't, if he says, he flied into the sky. So then that might be when I correct him. Well, okay. He flew into the sky.
And I love that just modeling because I think sometimes when kids make a language error, they'll make it often or many times before it gets corrected. And as parents, we tend to want to say, it's not flied, it's flew, right? And just give them the correct word. And I think that does two things. That kind of, inadvertently tells the kid they were wrong. And then I also think out of context, just giving them a different word without repeating the whole sentence and hearing it in that context, it's not going to make a change. It's not going to make a difference. Right.
Yeah. And that's where sometimes we have to do, sometimes I do specific activities around that grammatical skill. Right. So, and I thought, and, I say to the child, okay, we're going to, talk about things that happened before, or they already happened, so they happened in the past. So I would say yesterday he flew in the sky. Yesterday they jumped. And then there's irregular versus regular past tense. But either way, I sometimes I really explicitly have to teach that skill. So explicit instruction is extremely important for some of these kids who aren't picking up these oral language skills with that repetitiveness that we're constantly giving them, even just through the instruction. Sometimes we have to really take them aside and focus on that particular skill that they're struggling with, if they're not just picking it up through these little corrections, right? So,
and I think that's that is kind of grammar, but I think that's with anything that kids might say that's not coming across maybe the way we traditionally say that, is just to continue to model the correct way or the correct vocabulary, the correct sentence structure. And eventually, like you said, kind of almost through osmosis, kids just pick it up as this is the way we do it, right? Versus making it like you did it wrong and I'm going to correct you.
It's tricky, like for speech, when I'm working with a child for speech, and if the child knows sometimes kids don't realize we're even working on
what
articulation.
We're doing, yeah.
But for the kiddos that are they know what we're there for, they know we're there to work on our sounds. Before they answer, I'll say, okay, now remember, we have to use your back speech sound, like your k sound. So I cue them before they answer. Mm-hmm. So then I'm giving them the reminder before they speak, so then we're not then going back to correct after, right? So instead of just asking them, like, what has whiskers and says meow, and then they would say tat sometimes, right? They're not saying that k. And then I would say, oh no, you forgot to say your k sound. So instead of that,
front-loading it.
I would, so and say, okay, I'm going to ask you a question, and your answer is going to have a back sound in it. What has whiskers and says meow? And then I'd point to my throat even to cue them, like k, right? And then hopefully that builds that awareness a bit more for them too, I think, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But that's just articulation. For language, that's a bit harder to do sometimes. But again, if it was grammar, and if I said, remember, we're talking about something that happened before, and we have to add that t, like he jumped, and then what did he do? And then the child would maybe say he climbed, right? And I'm like, yeah, you added the. Yes. So it's, again, like you said, front loading that interaction and that opportunity for them to say it correctly.
Right. So I think I want to bring in here, two other terms, receptive language and expressive language, because a lot of times in education and as teachers, we'll talk about those things with parents, and there are, again, other terms that sometimes are confusing or we're not quite sure what they mean. So are you able to kind of tell us the difference between receptive and expressive language?
Yeah. So within each of those oral language parts, right, the syntax, morphology, and pragmatics, and vocabulary, there's expressive and receptive parts to each. So a child might have good understanding of vocabulary, but maybe doesn't use vocabulary very effectively or very well. It could be even pragmatics. Maybe they they kind of understand some of what the pragmatic rules are, but maybe have a hard time actually implementing what they know, if that makes sense. So because you could talk to them about it all day and read books about, proper social interactions, and they could say, okay, and kind of tell you, what to do, like what they're interpreting. But when they actually have to go to do it, it might be hard for them, if that makes sense. Again, a child might understand your sentence of, okay, before you go put on your shoes, get your coat. But they may not be able to use, like, their expressive part of it. They may not be able to say that, if that makes sense, right?
Right.
So, yeah, they can understand some of these things, or it could be the other way around. Sometimes I'll do assessments and then I'll see that kids have nice expressive language, but then the comprehension is lower, which normally comprehension is higher than expressive, right? So when we think back to babies, they are receptively taking in language first before they we understand more before we speak it, right? So sometimes I'll see the flip side where I'll do an assessment and a child will get expressive scores that are higher than their receptive. So then what essentially kind of happens is those kids kind of fly under the radar, where they talk a lot, but sometimes then it comes down, they really actually don't understand it, right?
Right. And I think it's important to note too that expressive language can be the oral piece, but there's also a written component to it as well, which is what we tend to see more in schools, where we just have those kids that if I ask them every question on my science test, they know all the information and all the knowledge. They've learned that content. But if I put that test in front of them and say, okay, write down the answers to the science test questions, nothing gets put to paper, or 2 or 3 words when they were this wealth of knowledge when they're telling me orally, right? Yeah. So I think that's a little known thing among parents, is that this can also come out in written form as well.
Yeah, again, going back to that quote, reading and writing flow on a sea of talk, right? So sometimes, if that oral language isn't there, you'll see it in their writing, right? I always get this too, when especially grade 1, 2, when kids are starting to write and spell. Teachers are coming to me and they're like, take a look at what they're writing. It's exactly how they're talking. And so it is, and that's sometimes that's an okay thing, because it's at least they're really thinking about what they're putting down on paper, right? Because they're thinking within all those grammatical errors, or even with their spelling, they're doing it phonetically. But it just transfers onto paper what they're thinking, right? Yeah.
So I think if it's safe to say, if we're not able to kind of have these early interventions and catch this when it's at the oral stage, it's going to lead into the written stage as they get older and move on in school.
That's why we spend a lot of time in kindergarten, because we have to bump up these skills as early as possible to, again, help close those gaps and to get them before, that writing and reading part kind of come in. So it's probably, like, I would say, like, within their school career, oral language is like the biggest part for their success. But
and maybe it's not just the academic piece, like we talked about in the intro. It's the social piece. It's the happiness level at school. Like it impacts so many different areas, not just that academic component at school.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
Okay, so if parents are listening today and they're thinking that some of this maybe sounds like their child, maybe, a piece here, a piece there, or maybe just in general, what would be their first steps? What do you think they should do?
Well, I think, again, it depends on the age of the child. If they're not in school yet, there's preschool services that might be available in the area for them to contact, and then get, some support from a speech language pathologist. Some parents seek out private speech and language services to get someone to come into their home, or they go to a clinic and help get some questions answered about their child that way. When they come to school, most schools have speech language pathologists within them that the speech language pathologist can support the child, but also maybe talking to the teacher. Like, that would probably be the first step within the school, is talking to the teacher. But if the teacher agrees with the parents and notices similar things, and with the support from the teacher, if things are still not improving, okay, now maybe we should do a referral for speech, right? So
I think that the classroom teacher, even if they're just in JK and just started school, but teachers tend to have a lot of experience with kids who have encountered various speech language
and we try
deficits. And I know in the schools you try to build capacity in teachers as well. And so if you've had one child with articulation issues, or with receptive language or expressive language, they tend to know what to do for the next ones that come along. So they can be a good ally as well.
And sometimes teachers don't know how to pinpoint it, right? But they do, they'll say, yes, I agree with the parent, like there's something, right? And I guess that's where my job comes in, right? Is to either give the teacher a checklist. Sometimes I go through a checklist with the parent to see if I need to investigate further. Sometimes the checklist is all I need. I do a checklist. I'm like, okay, I have some nice information here. Let's start working on these goals, right? So sometimes I don't need to do an assessment. Like, a lot of times I don't. It's all just based off, again, because language is on a continuum. If they're a certain age, and if I see they're not meeting those milestones, then I know what to work on, right? So that's kind of the nice thing about it. But at the same time, I sometimes do like to do assessments. And the other thing as well is if the child is a little bit more complex in other areas, whether it's focus and attention, maybe if I'm suspecting some difficulty with memory, sometimes I consult with the school psychologist to help figure out as a team, right? Figure out this child. And sometimes I go to, teachers, learning support teachers, to kind of let's get everybody on the same page. I'm a little concerned about this student. And then sometimes we go a bit further with...
I think that's a great point. Schools are, generally equipped with a team of people, all with their own specialties. And it's sometimes it's one isolated area like speech and language. Sometimes it's a little more complex and you might want to bring in occupational therapists or psychologists or teachers or support staff, EAs, DSWs, right? So it might take a team approach to kind of figure out the profile for that child and what strategies are going to work.
Yeah, because if everyone's on the same page for this child, the more likely the child will succeed, right? So, and I don't ever like to think that I know everything, right? So I want input from other people to kind of say, like, what do you, is it this? Is it, do we need to look a bit more? And, but yeah, so.
Well, that's amazing. I'm so happy you joined me today, Stacey. We could talk about oral language probably all day long.
I could.
But I know. But I think, we kind of we dove into it a little bit there, enough to hopefully give a general idea to parents listening, what oral language is, the different components, and maybe how to recognize if there's something more going on. And I think your point about listening to your gut is probably the best advice we could give parents on this topic. If you continue to feel like something's not quite right, it's probably worth a conversation.
And sometimes it's even grandparents that call me, because the grandparents have gone through it, right? With their own children. Yeah. And sometimes I get calls from them saying, what should, and so it can be anyone within the family even too, right? That even if it's like a niece that you're thinking of, right? It's, talk to their parent maybe, and go that route too.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully you'll have you back sometime soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was fun.
If you're a parent looking for more tools, strategies, or resources to support your child's learning, please visit my website, theparentseducator.com, or follow me at theparentseducator on all social media platforms. Thanks for listening to the podcast, School is Dumb. More episodes can be found on your favorite streaming platform. Thanks for tuning in. Till next time.